Welcome to today's APM webinar, Risk in a Changing World, Challenges to Major Programs, with our guest speaker, Craig Forson from Turner & Townsend. I'm Robert Allen, APM Branches Manager, and I'll be your host today. It's great to see so many people have joined us today, and I hope you're all well. I personally would like to thank all the volunteers of the APM branches and SIGs, and especially the Scotland branch, for allowing and putting in the effort to make this webinar happen. So over to Craig. Craig is a senior risk management expert with over 12 years project risk management expertise. Craig has worked as a client, contractor and consultant within the construction sector. Craig has supported the management of risk for major programs across Scotland and Ireland. So on that note, thank you, Craig, and over to you.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you to the APM for inviting me today to present. Good afternoon all, and thank you for dialing into this webinar. As Rob was saying, my name is Craig Forson. I'm an Associate Director of Turner & Townsend, and I'll be spending the next 45 minutes or so talking about risk management in the context of major construction projects, portfolios and programmes. In this webinar, I'll provide a quick overview into the nature of the major construction projects and why are they susceptible to emerging risks that are part and parcel of a changing world, and what you, as project management professionals, should be expecting from your risk managers and processes to make sure you're best prepared to manage your projects. Throughout, I will be changing between the terms project, programme and portfolio, although the content is relevant to all. So if there's any changes, if I say projects, it could be in the context of programme and portfolio as well. So it's good to stop off there following the phrase I'll be spending the next 45 minutes talking about risk management, which is encouraging. Before we kick off, it's probably worthwhile giving a quick introduction to myself in terms of who I am. As Rob kind of said there, I am a risk management professional with over 12 years of experience, and I am Turner & Townsend's risk management lead for Scotland and Ireland. I've been involved in the management of risk across a large number of projects, lost count if I'm being honest with you, including major programmes and portfolios in all shapes and sizes, so ranging from anywhere from £100,000 jobs all the way up to multi-billion pounds across a number of sectors. Some of the notable projects I've been involved in include the Edinburgh Tram Recovery Project and the subsequent Edinburgh Trams to New Haven project, as well as Network Rail's electrification schemes in Scotland and Barclays Glasgow campus. As Rob was saying, I've got insight and view from risk management from all sides, so I have been involved in the client side, I've been on the contractor side, as well as currently as, at the moment, consultant. I'm a certified fellow of the Institute of Risk Management, and the work I've done over the years has been awarded several awards. For those of you who are not familiar with Turner & Townsend, we are a large independent professional services company who specialise in programme, project and cost management and consultancy in the build environment across multiple sectors and industries. We support clients across the world involved in some of the largest and high profile projects in the world at the moment. If you want to find out more, please visit our website or feel free to get in touch via LinkedIn. So, construction projects often get a bad name or publicity within the press. At the moment, you can see on the screen some real examples of headlines, censored of course, so the project or client isn't there. People understandably get upset, particularly when they go wrong, particularly when they're usually very visible and can be disruptive to the surrounding area in terms of noise, road closures, excavation, etc. This can be further intensified when they are funded by the taxpayer or carried out by a public body. Now, looking at these headlines here, you'll notice that there's general themes which tend to focus on them being increased costs and delayed completion dates, as well as the press and the media. There's also well-known publications from McKinsey and KPMG, as well as academics such as Professor Flyberg on the subject on why major projects tend to go over budget and are being delivered late. So the question therefore remains, why do major projects have a tendency to be delivered late and tend to be over budget? And that intensifies, particularly when it's been a known issue for so long. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the magic bullet because, as you'd expect, there is not one specific smoking gun as the root cause in answer to the question. However, it is worth understanding the nature and basics of how the projects are actually developed through the stages. Now, it's also worth noting, generally, organisations do not want to undertake major projects and programmes. It's not what they do, and they know it's risky. Majority of organisations are generally there to make a project or provide a service and not embark on these major construction projects. Therefore, they tend to be a necessary evil to support growth or expansion, to replace or upgrade existing assets, or actually to react to any changes in laws and regulations, etc. As it's generally not their thing, coupled by the fact that major projects are a significant outlay in terms of resources, etc., and reputational risk potentially if they don't go wrong, organisations usually adopt a gateway or stage gate process or system to provide the ability for them to assess the confidence of the ability to proceed with the project throughout the process. Now, organisations tend to have their own version of this. I've set out a very typical process or gateway process on the side there. You'll see that it broadly aligns to the APM's conception, development, handover, etc. Model that's within the body of knowledge. Now, what I'm going to go through now is go through each one of these stations, give you an idea of the timescales in which it takes to go through these. So if we start at the strategic business case, here, what you would do is actually basically set out the need of what you're trying to do. So this could be you're building a new office in a new location, you're replacing the existing infrastructure, or you're looking to support growth or take advantage of a perceived business opportunity somewhere. For this, what you're basically realizing is that we need to do something. To get to this stage and kind of set out a kind of plan of what you think needs done, that could take anything up to 6 months for you to then develop this strategic business case and get it approved. Following that, you would then usually lead on to an outline business case. If you get past the first stage, you'll look to develop the potential scope options around your need and try and develop some high-level estimates for what each part could be. Now, that again could take anything up to a year once you detail out potential options and start kind of getting into a wee bit more detail. The enabling stage, this is where you would look to select an individual option and further develop the scope, as well as begin to consider if you were going to build this or procure this, what strategy would you take so you'd be ready to engage with the market. From here, you would tend to refresh your outline business case to make sure everything still stacks up. Leading on here, you would then lead on to the development stage, and that's when you start to detail out the design a bit further. And if you do need some approvals, whether it be from your local council or whether it be from a statutory body, you would seek to get these in place at this moment in time. As well, at this stage, you would tend to look at get your procurement documents set out, so when you're ready to go to the market, you're all set. That then leads on to your procurement and final business case. So at that point, you would then look to procure the works. You would have your scope already designed, fully designed, send out to market, select your contractor once you've got your prices, and at that point, look to get your final business case all prepared and ready. Following there, you can actually start to build the thing. Now, for major projects or programs or portfolios, this could be a good number of years at actual construction stage before you then lead to handover. Now, usually when I do get to this stage of the presentation, I usually ask the audience for the suggestions on when they believe the budget and completion dates for major projects going through this process are actually set. Now, obviously I can't do that, obviously I can't do that now, so we'll just have to go with the kind of virtual option. Now, it may surprise you that generally it's these two stages when a budget and completion date is set for a major program. Now, there's very good reasons for this. Major projects, as I say, are a major outlay for organisations. Therefore, they need to obtain and align the funding, because not many organisations have a spare couple of £100 million sitting under the bed for a rainy day. However, the kind of flip side of that is you appreciate that the design, the costs and schedules don't tend to be fully developed at this stage, and there's a vast amount of assumptions. However, despite this, that is usually when the goalposts are set, and any variance in these dates and costs is often fraught with scrutiny. Now, with the amount of people on the call, I'm more than confident there's a lot of clever people in terms of mathematics, and you've worked out that that's actually quite a time difference there between your budget and completion date being set and the construction being complete for major projects and programs. Based on what I've just that timeline there, that's anywhere between the last 7 to 10 years. Now, to put this into context, we're all aware there is some major programs and projects currently getting undertaken now. Now, if you think about what's actually happened in the last 10 years and what they've currently had to adapt to and emerge to from this, it is quite interesting. So again, this is going to be quite hard over a virtual context, but usually ask for a show of hands. So I'm going to ask for a virtual show of hands up. Who currently owns or has previously owned a tablet device over the last 10 years? Now, obviously I can't count hands, but I'll make an assumption that at least a few have got their hands up, or at least acknowledging they have bought a tablet or been involved in a tablet over the last 10 years. Well, if I asked you this back in 2010, there would actually been very few of you that would have had a tablet, as the iPad had just been launched. Now, for the avoidance of doubt, I want to be perfectly clear, I'm not saying that Apple or the introduction of tablets or iPads is the cause for major projects being delivered late or going over budget. However, what I'm trying to demonstrate is technology is evolving at a rapid pace, and this does cause problems for major projects and programs being developed over a large period of time. For example, I worked on a project which, by the time the telecom system was due to be installed, the technology that had been developed at the initial stage had actually became obsolete, and it was actually silly to even install it. So that was a last minute. When it came to the bit of actually installing, they had to make a last minute change, which cost millions of pounds to sort and do it. So over time periods, technology has advanced quite drastically. We then start going through 2011, the last space shuttle missions had been completed successfully, and the Arab Spring protests were taking place. If we look back to 2012, that was when we had the London Olympics. So, by the way, not necessarily saying this has anything to do with it, I'm just trying to make you all feel a wee bit old as we go through this. 2013, the EU starts to bail out Cyprus. We fast forward to 2014, and for a number of reasons, we actually begin to see the oil prices begin to steadily fall. Now, not only does this reflect on commodity prices and how they can fluctuate over the years and the impact that can have on major projects, if you think back to round about that time, 2014 and there or thereabouts, there was actually a lot of movement and a lot of businesses trying to relocate and build around the oil industry, and they all get quite heavily impacted. For example, I remember there was a number of projects that were being delivered in the Aberdeen area, or organisations seek to move out there to take advantage of what at the time was a booming industry. We then fast forward to 2016, and not only was it the year that Leicester won the Premier League, we start to see the pound fall against the euro. Now, there was a couple of reasons for this, the main one being the result of the Brexit referendum. Now, fluctuations in currency can impact projects in a number of ways. The obvious one is when you're importing supplies and products from abroad, as well as the variance in the level of your supply chain. Now, if you think if a contractor in a large construction project is getting paid in pounds, but they're then paying their supply chain in euros, you can begin to see how large fluctuations can start causing problems pretty quickly with the scale of the money that we're talking about getting paid. We then fast forward to 2018, and what was probably a significant impact in the construction industry, and that's when we saw the collapse of Carillion in the UK. Now, not only did this impact a lot of major projects which were on site and had Carillion who were procured to deliver them as a contractor, but it did cause ripple effects through the supply chain as well as changing the face of procurement going forward. Throughout this period, contractors are looking to change the way they contract, and the terms and conditions they get into basically are surrounding the risk they want to take. Now, this impacts not only the supply chain, but also impacts the organisations looking to develop the projects. It impacts the market, and it also impacts the methodology and strategy in which organisations look to engage in the supply chain and contractors. We'll skip 2019 because, well, 2020 has been a quiet year so far, if we think about it. We've had the small inconvenience, which has been in the shape of the COVID-19 health pandemic. Now, this has impacted, and it's going to impact us for many years to come, obviously. But it is also worth forgetting, when we're thinking about 2020, there is what was originally at the beginning of the year, from a UK point of view at least, what was considered a colossal, but now in comparison seemed tiny issue at this exact moment in time, which is Brexit, which, if we think about it, it's coming up again towards the end of the year, December. Now, if you think in the context of just Brexit and COVID-19 alone, 2020 and beyond is going to continue to be a changing and uncertain world for a lot of major projects, not only in what they do, but also how the environment which surrounds them. Now, that's just a quick whirlwind over the last 10 years, but if that wasn't enough, throughout this period, we have had significant political changes with associated impacts throughout. Now, this doesn't just impact the country in which the political changes happened. If you think about the UK alone, in this time frame between 2012 onwards, we've had 4 different prime ministers at this time, as well as the 2 major referendums. Now, there's necessary changes that come with changes, etc. But that can have an impact through policies and regulations, etc. That's just a quick touch on it. We could go into more details, and political changes over the years you could actually spend. We could want its own hour slot, but there's currently ongoing things with regards to the US and China, the cyber in terms of Russia and how governments, etc., are potential influence in cyber, etc. So there's quite a lot that can go in there, which can have impacts throughout into major programs. Something as well is there's been a change in the landscape of media in this timescale. There has been a surge in social media and push towards 24-hour media. Now, that's that and alone. That, if you consider that in itself before you actually discuss the impact of what's fake news, etc., that's quite significant. Again, to be clear, I'm not saying that BBC, Twitter, Facebook, etc., are to blame for the way the world, the reason why major programs, etc., are in bother. However, it's the way the world now reacts to news stories which is causing a different landscape, which can have knee-jerk reactions, which then can have unintended impacts to major projects. I remember I was involved in a project at the time where the UK steel industry was being in trouble, and a media outlet contacted the organisation asking if they were using British steel. Now, long story short, without going into any details, long story short, they weren't. However, the decision was made to protect the reputational impact. The change was made from what was originally, where the steel was originally come from, to then use the British steel at quite short notice. Therefore, that had quite a significant impact across the programme. We could talk about the fact that there's been increased terrorism and natural disasters, which, if you think, how does that influence in major projects? It can lead to changes in regulation and design requirements, which, if you're partway through a project or you've already kicked off, that can cause quite significant impacts throughout. There are other things that have happened as well, like change of laws, like regulation, which can impact projects. And that's before we talk about things such as like the climate emergency, which we haven't even touched on at all. So to kind of move us forward, whilst you can understand that time alone isn't the sole reason for major projects or programs portfolio being perceived as failing, you can see that how they can be susceptible to these impacts that can emerge from a changing world. In fact, you could probably even argue that the pace of change and uncertainty is increasing. If you think of 2020 alone, that a lot has happened in the space of 8 months, which is going to have lasting impacts throughout the coming years. And that, coupled with some projects becoming more ambitious and increasing in scale, the risk that they could be important is vast. And what scale of understanding do they actually have at the early stages where these budgets and completion dates are actually set? Now, obviously, it's impossible to successfully predict and assess the scale of some of these events in years, in the many years in the future. You just can't do it. However, in terms of risk management, how we move forward, there is no excuse for not identifying and assessing and managing the risks you do know about. So before you even think about how we're going to react to this changing world, what can we be doing? So as project managers, the questions you should be asking when you're coming up and developing these major projects, or even projects you get involved in at all from a risk management point of view, is how can I manage the risk and uncertainty that I do know about? So you'll need to be asking yourself, how do I actually do that? Do I actually know what I want or need from my risk manager or risk team? What do I know what I actually need from my risk management process? And am I doing all I can in getting the most from my risk process? So what we're going to do now is we're going to cover some of these basic questions and make sure you're aware of what you can control in terms of a risk management point of view. Now, kind of easy place to start here. As with anything, get the basics right. Now, risk management in particular, there is a tendency for people to overcomplicate risk. Now, I'll be brutally honest, I'll put my hands up. Risk managers or risk professionals tend to be the worst for it. Try and make yourself look very clever and say, yeah, we can do all this analysis, Monte Carlo, blah, 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 and try and bamboozle everyone with complications. Where in reality, if we're being brutally honest, the only people that need to know the ins and outs of Monte Carlo quantitative risk analysis is the risk professionals themselves. Everyone else just need to be able to assist with the identification, assessment, treatment of risk, which actually, if you look at it on the surface, is actually reasonably straightforward. Now, I'm sure all of us in this call, without fail, have been involved in poorly run risk workshops where you're sitting in the room for hours, if not days, when in fact only one or two of the risks within that monster risk register are actually relevant to you. Now, this is only not frustration, but actually frustrating for yourself, but it actually puts you off engaging with risk management, which can ultimately make the project harder for everyone involved. Now, this is a problem I come across quite a lot as I'm coming in off the back of someone or a team that's not been managing risk correctly, and trying to get people re-engaged is a problem. Now, for major programs and projects, an easy way of getting around this kind of bit is actually getting the proper structure of the risk registers is a good start. For projects that are major for the scale, a single catch-all risk register will not work for a number of reasons. Mainly the fact that, as I said, there's going to be a large number of risks, and anyone is going to disengage if you're having to sit through that all through it. Therefore, setting out a structure of package registers, which are complemented by specific registers at each level, for example, a program level register and portfolio level, will mean the right people are reviewing the risks that are relevant to them, and the number of risks they're looking at is relevant for that particular level. So if you think about it, the project team will be dealing with the stuff that's specific to the project. Now, that register might be pretty large. You'll have representation from project managers, cost managers, engineers, etc. And they'll be given specific information that will be relevant to that register. You take it a level up, the program or portfolio registers, they tend to be, they're not just a roll up of every single package register. They should actually have the registers which are specific to that program level register. By that, what I mean is risks that influence the overall objective of the program are not specific to one individual package, but they're actually strategic in nature. So it means that that register will be slightly less risk, so that tends to be reviewed by the senior team, who have probably got less time, therefore they don't need to see every single green risk that's in that register. So the beauty of this is as well, you have the ability to roll up into one big register, so you do have an overall list, but it means everyone is spending the right time at the right level for what we're getting doing. The other one is actually getting a proper risk process set up early and using it correctly will also get the basics right. Making sure that you've got in a position to regularly be able to identify, assess, and review your risks on an ongoing basis. We will come back to treatment later on. That will go a long way to supporting you understand your risk profile and assist with your decision making. It's not hard, to be honest with you, to be able to identify, assist, and regularly review your risk register. Your risk manager should be able to do the majority of the heavy lifting here. All the project team really need to do is just turn up and give all the information, just literally do a brain dump, and the risk management professionals will just do the rest. Don't get me wrong, the first time you get going with setting up a new risk register, the first couple can be time consuming. But for any project, as long as you keep doing it and updating it on a regular basis, catching new risks, updating your assessments, and doing it regularly, the actual process, the risk review process and risk register review process will gradually become less onerous, and you'll begin to see a lot more benefit. If you trust the information you're putting in and trusting the risk management professional and getting them involved in other things as well, so they get involved in meetings just outside the risk register review, you'll start seeing you get a lot more information and data from your risk register, which will help. Now, this may sound silly, but would you believe I still come across projects that will just put an arbitrary percentage uplift on the estimate to provide their contingency figure? To be clear, contingency should not be based on an uninformed percentage uplift, but should be more based on an assessment of your risk exposure. Now, in addition to this, my pet hate is when you saw, if you think back to the slide there where I had the gateways,
Now, at each of these gateways, you tend to go through a risk assessment to define what your risk exposure is at that time. Now, my pet hate is getting the project team coming to me maybe a day before, a couple of days before they're going for gateway with no risk register, asking me to provide a risk register template output that can be then put forward with the submission. Now, considering projects and programs are going to be living with the consequences of this arbitrary contingency number that's getting living for the remainder of the project, if you do not get that bit assessed right and the right effort and right amount of time to put in there, the project will be forever chasing an unrealistic cost and schedule target, which is not good for anyone. In the early days, when I first got involved in risk management, I lost count the number of times I was asked to produce a risk register output in a couple of days without anything to start with. So, as I say, get it started early and get something in place that's just the regular update. So when it comes to these stage gates, it's not a scramble, last minute scramble. You've got all the information there and it's fairly straightforward. The other one is actually assessing the cost impact of your risk correctly. Now, there is a tendency for projects just to put cost impact analysis against the risk register items in the risk register only. In reality, that's not really a robust assessment of risk. In order to gain a more reflective risk exposure, projects need to split out their assessment into the main sources of uncertainty. And this onion demonstrates that quite well, what we call the complete cost risk exposure. So the four main areas of uncertainty within a risk is the discrete risk items. So this would be, for example, an event that may or may not occur and have a cost impact. Your estimate uncertainty, that is the fact that estimates in their very nature are uncertain and there will be variances there, so an assessment on that will be good. Your actual cost of schedule delay, so risks impact, but yes, they'll have a cost impact, but they'll also have a delay impact, and that needs to be costed as well. And also the unknown unknowns. So that's acknowledging that at this exact moment in time, you cannot, as a project, foresee everything that's going to happen. Now, there's been a major shift, particularly over the last 10 years, in allowance for this unknown unknowns. Previously, if I said this 10 years ago, I'd have been laughed and kicked out of the room, whereas now organisations are beginning to pick up on this. Now, the basis of this approach is founded on the fact that isolating each area and analysing the components in their own right, that will provide a more reflective assessment on the project's risk exposure. You take all these inputs and you actually run them as a single quantitative risk analysis. Before anyone drops off, just to be clear, I'm not going to go into the detail of Monte Carlo or anything, so you can be lucky on that one. If you think back to what I was saying, there was a tendency for projects to cover everything in a single risk register. If you're trying to capture all this uncertainty within single line estimates within a risk register, you may actually be artificially over or underestimating your risk exposure, particularly in the cost of schedule delay. In reality, schedules are dynamic in their nature and risks may impact on activities which are happening at the same time. Now, if a risk is impacting activities which are happening, it's happening concurrently, there's only going to be one delay impact, it's not going to be two. So if you're trying to reflect all this in a single line estimate, you might actually be inflating or under-inflating your cost of delay. And that is quite massively an issue. Now, as I say, going through these different levels of the onions, I mean, you've got the discrete cost risks here. Now, as I say, that tends to just be a risk register. And instead of capturing everything within these single line items, think back to the last slide, you've identified and clearly put out what each risk is. From there, all you're doing is looking at doing a probability and a cost impact for these based on, if possible, a minimum, a most likely, and maximum point of view. Your estimate uncertainty, what you're looking here is you take your estimate at a certain level and you'll look through it and start saying, right, is this an optimistic estimate? Is it a pessimistic estimate? And the way you do that is work with the person or the team who have developed the cost plan and look at things such as volumes, rates, and the cost per units. So you start putting variances on, plus or minus on those. The cost of schedule delay, the best way to do this is to try and link this all in what we call a quantitative schedule risk analysis. From there, you assess your duration uncertainty associated with the program, the project program's schedule itself,
as well as linking the impact of these risks from a schedule point of view within the schedule. You'll run it through, it will give you outputs. From there, you link these inputs into the cost of delay. That would be the delay of the contractor and or the client and the organizational costs as well. Unknown unknowns is a hard one, because obviously how much do you assign for each one for something that you don't know? We have seen multiple ways of doing this, whether it be taking an output of the quantitative risk analysis. So basically, all the other steps above that, you would try and run in a single quantitative risk analysis. Ideally, you would have a cost-loaded schedule and run it through that. However, they tend to be quite hard to get. Therefore, we would try and take all these and put them in a single QCRA if possible. You can take the output of that to help inform your unknown unknowns, whether it be the standard deviation or variance in some of the confidence levels. Additionally, the subject that also comes up here usually is what about the relationship with optimism bias, and also things such as reference class forecasting. Now, optimism bias is an allowance which is set out usually in different documents such as the Green Book, etc., on the basis that there's the common conception that people tend to be optimistic when looking at the outcome of certain events. So this is an allowance, usually a percentage uplift, on top of your base estimate to show that to try and allow cover from anything like that. Now, if you've got optimism bias, you then have to look at how that relates with your unknown unknowns. Reference class forecasting is something similar. So there is organisations that are available who have got basically portfolios or databases full of project outcomes, who can then look at your project, look at the nature of it, and then seek to look out on, based on the type of projects you've got, this is typically, looking at similar projects, would be the increase in cost and delay that would come out against it. So again, if you're going through reference class forecasting, you may want to look at your unknown unknowns. The important thing when assessing risks is to try wherever possible to get your quantifications based on historical impacts, whether it be previous projects that the organisation has undertaken before, or based on experience. The more informed and imperial data that you have got makes it a more robust risk analysis. Now, once you've got all this, all these risk and uncertainty sources of uncertainty need to be looked and linked at together as a collective. You need to bring it all together. From your risk manager should also be working closely with other disciplines such as commercial, planners, project controls, to make sure they're up to date with everything and linking the output of the risk analyses into their disciplines as well. Now, for major projects, quantitative risk analysis is quite important. It's probably the best tool which risk management can provide. However, what I tend to find is organisations are spending a lot of time, and projects spend a lot of time doing the QRA, getting all the information. However, all they're interested in is whatever p-value output is getting reported against, whether that be P80, P50, whatever. It's always, what's my P80, what's my P50? Now, apologies, by the way, for those not fully versed in QRA, but when I say like P80, that would mean from the model that's run 80% of the time, that level, the output was less than that level. So, i.e. 80% of the time, that value would be enough to cover the risks that you've assessed and included. Now, if a project's only focusing on the p-value, they're not actually appreciating the full story and the benefits from the QRA. Now, all QRAs, particularly for major projects, involve a lot of time and a lot of input from the project team. So you'd be silly not to take advantage of all the outputs that come out. Now, in terms of reporting QRA, the first thing as a project manager you should be asking for is, what are the assumptions that were based on this? Now, if any you feel are invalid or don't look right, then your output is meaningless. The last thing you want to do is report a P80, which has been based on a wild assumption which you know is invalid at the first time, because that's just going to give you you're basically going to be given false results and you're potentially setting yourself up for trouble. The next thing you usually look at is, what were the dates of the inputs? So that QRA, so the onion I showed you previously, that would have inputs such as your cost estimate. So you want to know what is that the latest cost estimate you're looking at? It would have your project schedule. What was the date of the project schedule we're looking at? It would have your risk register. So you'd be asking, when was the last time a risk register was updated? So if you're thinking right now, so if I was doing a QRA for your project now based on a cost estimate in February, a schedule in January, and a risk register of today, they are not aligned, and the world has moved on significantly since then. Therefore, the output of your QRA is no longer valid, or it potentially is. It's going to be again surrounded a bunch of assumptions that you need to consider. You should then be asking for, right, what is the key influencing? So I've got my P80, for example. What is driving that? So you'll be able to look at things such as, is it my estimate? Is there a certain area of my estimate that's putting that? Is it my excavation? Is it my groundworks, etc.? Is there certain activities within my schedule that's causing this, that's causing the main influence of this output? Now, I've put latent critical paths here. Now, tend to be in projects, everyone is aware of the critical path. The beauty and one of the key outputs of a QSRA, which is the schedule risk analysis, is that sometimes what we call latent critical paths are identified. So these are activities or paths or WBSs within your schedule at the moment which are causing no bother at all. However, by the time a couple of risks are impacted, a wee bit of uncertainty in your schedule, all of a sudden these are the driving areas of your schedule. This can be a golden nugget if you find these early. So therefore you should be asking for activities and what if any additional latent critical paths were identified. If you had, I remember a project I was working on where we found one of these 3 months in advance, which gave us plenty of time to try and treat and manage and mitigate the overall impact on that, which yes, it did impact. However, the impact wasn't significant as if that came as a surprise. So always ask for your key drivers. That includes risk. Now, there might be, particularly with QSRAs, a risk that might be what you would consider insignificant is actually driving quite significant on the output of your QRA. Now, don't get me wrong, there is sometimes where it comes out and it doesn't look right, and you start discussing it, and then you think, actually, that assessment isn't correct, and you redo it. However, there is some where you look at it, and you think, yeah, that assessment is actually correct. So therefore, that should then dictate on what risks you should be focusing your attention on and managing. And as I said, we've already looked at the areas of estimate. Now, confidence level. So we've asked, as I say, we've been asked for the P80, but what is the context of that? You should be comparing, in terms of your overall cost of risk exposure, you should be comparing that against your remaining contingency going forward. So you should be able to identify, as I say, early on if there's a potential problem with your risk exposure versus your contingency. Identifying a problem 3 or 4 months in advance is better than coming back cap in hand at the last minute saying, I've actually run out of money. And it's the same with the schedule. You will have your schedule output from your QSRA. You'll be able to compare how that is against not only your schedule, but your estimated completion date. So you can then start looking at what are the key drivers in order to bring that back. And lastly, actions. As I say, look at all the information we can get from a QRA, but if you're getting this information and not actually doing anything about it, that's going to look bad, particularly when something does go wrong, if you can be seen that you've had this information in advance. So always look at actions required, whether it be a wee bit more information or a wee bit more investigation into areas of the programme which cause an issue. Same with the estimate, or what risks we should be prioritising in terms of treatment actions. Now, this is my biggest bugbear, which is why I've left a whole slide for it. And this is actually driving risk treatment. It follows on nicely from what I just talked about there. Now, the quote I've put in here is, bear in mind that the profession is risk management. In projects environment, the management and treatment of risk, ironically, is often the main oversight in risk management. Now, I'd love to say that was a wise man said that. That was actually myself. So that's a Forson 2020 quote. But basically, it's true. Now, in projects environment, there is a lot of reasons why the challenges, that this causes in terms of risk treatment. The number one is, particularly in major programs and projects, etc., there is a vast number of risks. Just by their nature, they're risky, they involve a lot of different things. So you've got a lot of risks, hundreds of risks, and that coupled by the fact that project teams tend to be small, that is particularly evident at the beginning of the early stages of a project. So basically what you have is a large number of risks with only a small team to actually manage them. That is as well coupled by you're always chasing the next priority or stage gate or milestone in the program, so there is timescale constraints. Projects move fast and you only have a limited time to treat them sometimes. Now, What I often see is every single risk in that register, whether it be 700 risks, 300 risks, 100 risks, each one, there's been a lot of time set out in terms of articulating and detailing what the risk treatment action is for that risk, whether it be one or two, and then a date against it. And then when you come up to review the risk register, have you done it? No, move it out, move it out, move it out. And that is because they've got so many to try and manage. So what we've been trying to develop to kind of help this is actually start targeting or focusing on specific risk management treatment actions to make sure they get done. Now, by that, what I mean is select for each person on the project, they have got 5 or 6 treatment actions that they're getting monitored and reported against every period. Now, for that, you would select all your treatment actions or these treatment actions based on things such as what is the scale of the risk that we're looking at? How sensitive is the impact of that risk? Does it impact multiple things? Is there more than just one impact? How close is that risk impact period from approaching? What is the time frame in which this action can only be completed? Now, if you think to a project, a lot of these risks can only be mitigated and closed out at the beginning of a project. Therefore, if you don't act at that stage, you've lost it. And also the effectiveness of the action. There's no point in chasing a mitigation that's actually, or a treatment action that's actually not going to make that much of an influence on the risk impact itself. Therefore, picking on ones that are going to greatly reduce the risk or actually impact a number of risks, you'd look to get these. So as I say, if you focus on 5 or 6 treatment actions per person and challenge them on those rather than the hundreds that they've got in the register, actually I've seen it make a massive difference. There was one project in particular that by doing this, not only did we see an increase on the closure of mitigation actions and the decrease of risk, over a 6-month period, there was a 6-figure reduction in risk exposure, which in the context of the project was pretty significant. Now, and also the whole risk treatment thing, if you take a step back and think about it, is there any excuse as project professionals for identifying and assessing a risk but then actually doing nothing about it? There's not really. It's quite hard to find an excuse for that when the time comes. Therefore, managing the risk that you know about, that provides you in a better place to react to any changes that may emerge from a changing world. Now, I think in terms of one of the feelings of risk is try to get people engaged. I talked earlier on about the fact that we've all sat in these horrible risk reviews that take hours and everyone falls asleep, etc. Now, I think there's a lot for the risk managers here that we need to do a lot more as a profession to try and get more engagement, not only from the project team, but make it, as I say, more efficient use of time. And for me, I think a lot of this can be done by getting the basics right, but also embracing technology. So trying, wherever possible, move away from spreadsheets. I'd imagine the majority of people have been involved in risk registers where the whole thing is just a big, massive Excel spreadsheet. Now, I'm not saying that you can get rid of them as a whole, but what you can maybe do is try and actually, in the actual risk review sessions, is not throw that in front of someone. As I say, the risk professional can sit in the background with that, and that's fine. That's how they want to manage it, if that's what they want to do. However, if we embrace some in technology and try and make things more visual, more engaging. So what I've popped on the screen there is something we were looking to develop, which is a visual risk register. So instead of working your way down a risk register Excel spreadsheet, you would click on the dots. Each one of these dots represents a risk, which is then got the information behind it. So you'd raise the risk and talk about the risk there in context in a more visual manner. Also, something that's been developed by a colleague of ours in Turner and Townsend is an app called Capture Risk, which is basically risk identification sessions. Instead of everyone having post-it notes and all through that, it's actually have an app, and you can type in on your device, whether it be a tablet, which as we know now only came out in 2010, or your telephone, and actually raise it, and it will come on the screen live. So again, more engagement using more technology, and it's been working well where we've used it. Intelligent data. Now, this is quite a big one. The more we can try and embrace databases and getting more information on risk data in terms of impacting when it's not impacting, the more you can actually inform and better inform your projects going forwards. recently been involved in a client who we worked on making their own specific risk management database, and part of that was getting common risks. So this was risks that we knew were happening across the portfolio in near enough every project. From this data, we're now beginning to see trends in terms of these common risks, whether the impact and the scale of these impacts, by linking it to the change control process. So not only are we getting this, we can see in a few years where you open up a new risk register, you're creating it for a new project, you can actually have a lot of these risks already pre-populated with impacts that you know are relevant, and also probabilities based on these common risks that you know is actually happening. So that then allows you to focus on the more specific and more kind of niche risks that are associated with that project. And again, it saves time and it's more efficient use of time. The other thing is construction projects are trying to embrace other elements of IT and other technological advances. And again, risk management should be trying to bolt on and see what we can offer in the back of that, so everything's linking in. Because as I say, if you look at risk, as I mentioned previously, if you look at risk by itself, that's fine. However, you get more strengths if all of a sudden you start linking into the other disciplines, such as project controls, commercial, etc. Now, this is the second last slide you'll be glad to know. A common issue I see is projects tend to get risk management involved at the project delivery stage. And even with that, sometimes partway through the project delivery stage. Now, whilst I'm happy to get involved at any stage, if I'm being honest, in fact, I've made a career out of getting involved in the project delivery stage, there's actually a lot more risk can do at the beginning of a project. So I've tried to demonstrate that here in this slide. So if you look here at the early stages in terms of the project and contractual development, you can set out your risk strategy. You can get your risk registers developed so they're good to go. You're not playing catch up halfway through. If you get that done early and you've got a good view of your risk profile, whether it be the risk you're facing, the level of risk that you may have in terms of scalability, that can then inform your contract selection. So what risks are you willing to take, or what risks do you think you want the contractor to take in terms of buying? Now, if you've got that from an informed position, you're not relying or playing catch up when the contractor comes back or the market come back with these risks, and risks that the client might not be A, fully aware of what the risks they're taking, and B, willing to take. It also allows you to, as I say, it talked about focused or targeted treatment or mitigation. If you get involved at that stage in early doors, you can actually close out a number of risks early before they actually come and hit you at the project delivery stage. And also, we talked about it there, contingency cost allowance. That is basically what I'm saying there, is actually have your contingency based on your assessment rather than just an arbitrary percentage uplift. Now, if you get that done early and get it done at the beginning, that can be massively beneficial from a project. So when you get to the project delivery stage, you're focusing only on the risks you know you didn't have a chance to mitigate at the beginning, and you've got yourself better placed to treat the risks that are emerging from a changing world rather than the ones you knew about so many years ago. The final bit there is project closeout. A lot of the time I've been involved in projects and it gets to near the end, all of a sudden it's getting a wee bit more certain when the end date and the budget's going to be, the closing statement's going to be, therefore we don't need the risk management anymore, let's get them away. However, particularly in an organisational context, you're wanting to learn lessons from that project and make sure that they're then fed into the other projects that you may be embarking in, whether it be in a portfolio or future projects. Now that would be looking at the impact of your risks and making sure, as I discussed earlier on, making sure that then informs future risks, risk registers, etc. And also making sure that if there's any common pitfalls, not just from the risk management discipline, but anywhere else, that's then A, raised as a risk on the future projects, or B, something's done as a treatment action to make sure that doesn't happen again. Now, I appreciate that was probably a wee bit more than 45 minutes. I do like talking. I'm a middle child and I love an audience that doesn't has got no option but to listen to me. But before I open up the forum for any questions, I want to leave you with the following thoughts. Hopefully, you can see by their nature, major projects are susceptible to the risks that emerge from a changing world. And whilst there's a strong argument for not being able to predict, or you underestimate risks that are many years in the future, there is less of an excuse for you not having a managed risk process which provides the ability to identify and provide reflective assessments of emerging risks. If you've got a risk management process set up It means you'll identify anything emerging early, which gives you the best possible opportunity to react quickly and minimise the impact. From a project management professional point of view, what I'd like to leave you with is make sure you get your risk process set up early. Make sure you get your basics of risk management correct. Regularly review your risks and update your assessments so you're not playing catch up. Don't pay your risk process lip service. You actually use the outputs of all the time you've been putting in to help you make informed decisions based on the risk profile. And finally, make sure you actively treat and manage your risks. Now, I'm happy to take questions in the time we've got left. If we don't get to yours, I was going to say to Rob, or you want to discuss anything that we've covered today, please don't hesitate to contact me on LinkedIn and I'll get back to you.
Perfect, thank you, Craig. That's great knowledge that's been shared, and I can share with you that we've had some lovely comments from those in attendance that have said thank you for sharing, and it's also generated about 8 or 9 good questions as well. So without further ado, I'll proceed into those. But Catherine has asked, what are the common pitfalls you have seen in terms of risk management in projects?
Okay, so I think the kind of common pitfalls that kind of come across, we discussed some of them during the presentation there. I think for me, one of the major ones that I see time and time again is trying to fit too much into your risk assessments and actually try to fit quite a bit into an individual risk. So for example, ground conditions is a classic one in projects environment. I have seen people trying to cover ground conditions such as peat, excess water, groundwater, contamination, rock in a single risk, and then try and quantify, not only try and quantify that, all those items together, but then try and, if you think of the onion that I talked about earlier on, try to capture all that as well as that individual assessment. So you can probably see how why that can maybe overestimate or underestimate by doing that. If you have a properly guided risk management process or risk manager, will make sure you identify and split out all those individuals, because they're in essence individual risks themselves, and also make sure the onion assessment gets put in there. The other one is the kind of, I'll say again because I've mentioned it a few times, it's leaving the risk assessment in which to inform your contingency far too late in the process. You need to get the risk involved early, so it's just an update rather than a full exercise to be done in a short period of time, because you will be playing catch up. But probably the main ones are just in general paying risk management lip service, so going through the motions, just turning up to risk reviews, but actually not using anything, or just you're not putting the right effort in, which means you're not only getting misleading outputs, but you're actually not using the outputs itself, and you're missing out on all the benefits that a properly run risk management risk management process can do. And I think from risk managers, I think there's a lot on risk managers there to try and make it more engaging, but the project team need to try and work with the risk manager and get them more involved.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to combine David and Simon's questions. So David has said, would you say COVID-19 is considered a black swan event? And Simon's kind of linked into that by saying, did you have the global pandemic on your radar? And also, do you think this will impact the planning approvals process regarding local councils, etc., well into 2021?
Okay, that's quite a big one. Obviously, COVID's pretty topical now. So going back to the first one, in terms of black swan, obviously time will tell on that. But personally, I don't believe it is a black swan. The term black swan was penned by Nassim Taleb, and he's actually came out and said it's not. But if you go back to how it's defined as a highly improbable event which has an unpredictable massive impact. Now, global or health pandemic has been listed in a number of key areas, notably the World Economic Forum does a yearly or annual risk management kind of viewpoint or touch point, which has all the greatest key risks that are facing the world at the moment. And they've had that on for years, as well as the fact that we've had a couple of false starts over the years with swine flu, Ebola, SARS, aviation flu, etc. So to say that it's an unpredictable event, it's probably not. There's been enough warning in terms of that. So yes, it's having a massive impact, and going back to the second part of that, yes, this is going to be felt in not only major projects, it's going to be affecting the world now for years to come. Even after, if there is a vaccine comes out, there is going to still be ripple effects on this over the years. In terms of approvals, yes, I'd imagine there's going to be, I'm not entirely 100% up to speed with, in terms of approvals, in terms of, I think it was local approvals was the example given, but I'd imagine there's been a lot of organisations, including local authorities, that have had people reassigned to different areas, and therefore approvals, not only would they have been potentially submitted a wee bit later, but there's going to be a backlog to work through, so that will take some time to get through. Was it on registers? Yes, it was on registers. There was a job that I've been, one of the many jobs that I'm on now, but there was one example where the register it was on, and about 2 years ago they did a big purge of risks that they didn't feel were relevant or likely to occur, and that was one of them. However, it was picked up again fairly quickly once it kicked off last year, so it did come back on. But the thing is, with QRA, it's worth noting that that would be, particularly in a project element, there's an argument whether actually projects should hold anything for something of that scale. But there's a lot of risks that have low probability, high impact. And I think one of the things from a risk management point of view that may change after all this is those low probability, high impact risks may be given a lot more screen time than what they were prior to COVID coming out.
Excellent, thank you for sharing. There's definitely going to be some questions sent your way post-webinar. I'm aware that we've got a couple more minutes and probably about 10 or 12 good questions. A question that kind of stands out for me is from Peter, and Peter says, your language was all relating to risk being negative, in brackets threats, including the use of words mitigate and mitigation. Does your risk management process exclude positive risks or opportunities?
Not at all, and I apologise if that's the way it came across, because that's almost certainly not the way we do it. Risks are obviously by their nature are split into two disciplines. They are threats and opportunities. So threats are obviously the negative, opportunities are the positive. So everything that you heard there in context of the term risk would have been based on opportunities as well as threats. Now, I appreciate that a lot of the language I used there was probably more on the threat side, and that was based on, if nothing else, just based on the topic. We're talking about risks that emerge in a changing world. Now, obviously, there's opportunities that come with all the examples I gave there, but if we look at it from the context of a major programme, a lot of the things that come out tend to be more on the threat side. So, as I say, both threats and opportunities, but just the context of what would be the topic we've been talking about, there is obviously a wee bit more sidings towards the threat side.
Excellent, thank you, Craig. Would you be happy to answer one more, or how's?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So Andrew has said, hi Craig, you made a really interesting point that delay relating to risk can be double counted. If two delays occur in parallel, there'd just be one delay. Is there a technique to define a residual risk delay?
Yep, so the best way, as I touched on, and I apologise I flew over that bit because there is a lot of detail that onion kind of goes into. One of them, so the area that we're talking about there is the cost of schedule delay. The best way to do that is in a quantitative schedule risk analysis. So what that does is that takes your actual schedule from the project that you're working on, and you assign the risks, and basically you run it through and it'll come out with each milestone will be a p-value or confidence rating. So that in itself will account for, because it's the project's program that you're running it on, that will account for any risks that happen concurrently, and you only get the residual bit at the end there.
Excellent, thank you. I think we'll have one more question if you don't mind, and then I'll look to say goodbye to everyone. I can see Katie posted this quite early on, so I'm keen to ask this one. Katie says, how would you mitigate obsolescence risk over an 8-year project?
I take it that was in the context of technology. Obviously you won't have that, Rob. So I'll take it on the basis that it was to do with the technology. Now that's hard, and it is hard because how can you predict what you've got is cutting edge? I mean, if you think back to the iPad example that was brought out 10 years ago, I'd imagine there's less people now with tablets than there were 10 years ago, because there's other things. Your phones are a lot better now, and you can do pretty much anything with your phone that you could do in an iPad. So when it comes to technology, it's hard to kind of do that. Now, what I've seen some organisations do is they know they're doing something, and say telecoms, for example, and that forms part of the major project. Therefore, what they'll do is they'll develop a kind of concept, but not necessarily develop the detail until later on down the line, allow plenty of time in the schedule in which to do it. But it means that extra, say, 2 or 3 years, it means there's less chance of the technology being developed is going to be obsolete.
Perfect, thank you. Craig, it kind of leaves me just to say thank you for giving up your time and sharing your knowledge. There's been some lovely comments. Claire says, another highly insightful presentation. Thank you, Craig. Mohammed has said, amazing webinar. Loads of thanks. So people who have received this well are now extending further thanks. So on behalf of the APM, I'd like to say thank you for giving up your time, Craig.
Yep, thank you for having me. Thank you.
Perfect. And thank you for everyone for joining us today.